The evening was quiet. Weston walked into the house, tossing his keys onto the counter. He had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Samantha with dinner. Lately, he'd been feeling the need to reconnect. 15 years of marriage, after all, could use a little extra care now and then. As he passed the living room, something stopped him. In his tracks. Voices. Samantha's laughter carried faintly from the back patio. He paused, leaning slightly closer. Nicholas's deep voice joined hers. "You're unbelievable," Nicholas said, his tone teasing but laced with something else. "That loser trusts you with everything. The house, the kids, even me." Weston frowned, the words hanging oddly in his mind. His first instinct was confusion, but curiosity compelled him to take a step closer. The voices grew clearer. Samantha giggled. "I know. It's crazy, isn't it? He doesn't suspect a thing. He's just so oblivious." Weston's stomach tightened. He moved silently toward the patio door, peering through the crack in the curtains. Samantha sat on the wicker couch, leaning close to Nicholas, a glass of wine in her hand. Nicholas was smirking, a drink of his own in hand. 15 years, Nicholas said, shaking his head as if in disbelief. 15 years we've been doing this and he has no idea. Sometimes I wonder if he even cares." Weston's breath caught in his throat. He froze, trying to process the words. 15 years. Samantha smiled, swirling her. "Why? He's too trusting. Always has been. That's why it's been so easy. I mean, come on, Nicholas." He thought both kids were his. "Can you believe that?" Weston's knees felt weak. He clutched the doorframe to steady himself, his heart pounding violently in his chest. "The kids. Our kids." Nicholas chuckled, setting his glass down on the table. "Well, technically they're mine, not his. You just let him raise them." "Exactly," Samantha said with a grin. "And he's done a decent job, I guess. But let's be honest, he was never cut out for this. Too soft, too trusting. That's why I always needed you." Weston stumbled back a step, the world spinning. He fought the urge to burst through the door and confront them. His fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. But something held him back. "Not yet. Keep listening." Nicholas leaned forward, his tone dropping to something more serious. "Have you ever thought about telling him? I mean, what's the point of keeping it a secret now? The kids are older. He's bound to figure it out eventually." Samantha shook her head firmly. "No. He doesn't need to know. And even if he did, what could he do? Leave? Where's he going to go? His whole life revolves around me, the kids, and his job. He's trapped." Nicholas snorted. "That's cold. Even for you." Samantha smirked. "Cold? It's practical. Besides, I've put up with his flaws for years. The least he can do is keep playing his role while we get what we want." Weston's vision blurred as anger surged through him. Every word was another stab in his chest. For years he had trusted both of them, loved them even. He had invited Nicholas into his home countless times. I considered him a brother. And Samantha, the woman he had vowed to cherish, to protect. He bit down hard on his lip to keep from making a sound. His entire life had been a lie. Every moment of joy, every memory he cherished had been tainted by their deceit. "Speaking of practical," Nicholas said, leaning back with a sly grin. "Have you thought about what happens if he does figure it out? You know, the finances, the house." "Please," Samantha interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Everything's in my name. The joint account, the house. I've got it covered. If he wants to leave, let him. It's not like he'll have much to take with him." Weston's fists trembled. He felt a sharp sting of betrayal turn into something darker, something colder. The pieces of their scheme were falling into place. But it wasn't just the affair. It was the mockery, the utter disregard for him as a person. "Still," Nicholas said, taking a sip of his drink, "you have to admit, it's impressive how long we've pulled this off. 15 years. Samantha, that's a hell of a long time to keep someone in the dark." Samantha laughed again. "It is, isn't it? But that's the beauty of it. He trusts me so completely, he never even questioned anything. He just believed." Weston couldn't take it anymore. He turned away from the door, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He needed to leave before he gave himself away. As he walked quietly back toward the front door, he felt like a man escaping a burning building. Only the fire wasn't outside. It was inside him, consuming everything he thought he knew. He stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting his face like a slap. The laughter from the patio echoed faintly behind him, but he didn't look back. For 15 years, they had made him a fool. But not anymore. Standing by his car, Weston clenched his jaw, a plan already forming in his mind. They think I'm a loser? They think I'm trapped. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. They have no idea what's coming, he whispered to himself. And with that, he drove off into the night, leaving the life he thought he knew behind. 15 years earlier, Weston sat on the edge of a barstool at O'Malley's pub, nursing a beer. It had been a rough week at work, and he wasn't in the mood for company. That's when Nicholas, a tall, confident guy with an easy smile, slid onto the stool next to him. "You look like someone stole your lunch money," Nicholas said, grinning as he raised his own glass. Weston chuckled. "It's just work. Same stuff, different day." "Well, here's a tip," Nicholas said, clinking his glass against Weston's. "Stop thinking about it. It's Friday. Forget work and enjoy yourself. Life's too short." Weston smiled for the first time in days. "Fair enough. I'm Weston, by the way." "Nicholas," he said, extending a hand. That handshake was the start of their friendship. Over the months, Nicholas became the kind of friend Weston had always wanted, loyal, funny, and always there when needed. They bonded over football, late-night poker games, and a shared disdain for their demanding bosses. It was during one of those nights at O'Malley's that Samantha walked into Weston's life. "Whoa," Nicholas said, nudging Weston as they both turned to see her. "Now that's a 10 out of 10. Weston laughed nervously. "Yeah, she's gorgeous." "Then what are you waiting for?" Nicholas said, gesturing toward her. Weston hesitated, but Nicholas gave him a shove. "Go. Worst she can do is say no." Weston walked over, his heart pounding. Samantha was at the bar, talking to a friend. She glanced at him as he approached, her eyes warm and inviting. "Hi," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Can I buy you a drink?" She tilted her head, studying him for a moment before smiling. "Sure." That night they talked. For hours. Weston told her about his boring office job and his love for classic rock. She told him about her passion for teaching and her dreams of traveling. By the end of the night, Weston was smitten. Over the next few months, their relationship blossomed. Samantha fit seamlessly into Weston's life, and Nicholas quickly became part of their dynamic. The three of them were inseparable. Samantha adored Nicholas's humor, and Nicholas claimed Samantha was the best thing to ever happen to Weston. "You're one lucky guy," Nicholas told Weston during a barbecue at his place. "She's a keeper." Weston grinned, flipping burgers on the grill. "I know. I still don't know how I got so lucky." When Weston introduced Samantha to his parents, they fell in love with her immediately. His mother, Linda, hugged Samantha tightly the first time they met. "Weston's told us so much about you," Linda said. "You're even lovelier than he described." "Thank you," Samantha said, blushing. Weston's father, Tom, was equally welcoming. "So when's the wedding?" he joked, earning a laugh from everyone. Weston and Samantha got married a year later in a small ceremony. Nicholas was Weston's best man, standing by his side with a wide grin. "You've got a good one," Nicholas said, clapping Weston on the shoulder before the ceremony began. "Don't screw it up." "I won't," Weston said, his chest swelling with pride as he glanced at Samantha across the room. Their honeymoon was a dream, and for the first few years, their marriage felt perfect. They bought a modest house in the suburbs, and soon after, Samantha announced she was pregnant. "Weston, you're going to be a dad," she exclaimed, holding up the positive test. Weston was overjoyed, pulling her into a tight hug. "This is the best news ever." Nicholas was one of the first people they told. He showed up with champagne the next day. To the future parents, Nicholas said, raising his glass. Over time, Nicholas became a fixture in their lives. He was there for birthday parties, holidays, and countless late-night hangouts. When their first child, Lily, was born, Nicholas brought gifts and held the baby like a proud uncle. "Look at her," Nicholas said, rocking Lily gently. "She's perfect. You must be so proud." "I am," Weston said, beaming. 2 years later, their second child, Ethan, was born. Again, Nicholas was there, joking about how Weston now had his hands full. 2 kids under 3? "You're braver than I am," Nicholas said. With a laugh, Weston couldn't have been happier. He had a beautiful wife, 2 amazing kids, and a best friend who felt like family. Life was perfect, or so he thought. The cracks were there, but Weston didn't see them. There was the time he found Samantha and Nicholas laughing together in the kitchen, their heads too close for comfort. "What's so funny?" Weston had asked, smiling as he walked in. "Nothing important," Samantha said quickly, stepping away from Nicholas. Or the time Nicholas canceled plans with Weston at the last minute, only for Weston to find out later that Nicholas had been over at their house helping Samantha fix a leaky faucet. "Why didn't you call me?" Weston had asked Samantha. "I didn't want to bother you," she had replied with a shrug. "Nicholas was already here, so I just asked him to help." Weston shrugged off those moments, trusting them both completely. They were family. But now, as he sat in his car, replaying the conversation he had overheard the night before, Weston saw the past in a new light. Every laugh, every shared glance, every innocent excuse, they all took on a sinister meaning. The life he thought he had built was nothing more than an illusion. And for 15 years, he had been living a lie. Weston sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His mind replayed Samantha and Nicholas's conversation over and over again. 15 years. 15 years of lies. He slammed his hands against the steering wheel, the horn blaring in the empty street. He leaned forward, resting his forehead on the wheel, and let out a strangled growl. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself. Every memory he had with Samantha and Nicholas felt like it had been rewritten in his mind. Moments he once thought were innocent now seemed dripping with deceit. The time Nicholas accidentally left his jacket at their house and returned late at night to pick it up. The shared inside jokes between Samantha and Nicholas that Weston hadn't understood. The odd way his parents would sometimes avoid eye contact when Nicholas was around, as if they knew something they couldn't say. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. They all knew. The realization hit him like a freight train. His parents, the people who had raised him, who were supposed to have his back, had been complicit in the betrayal. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old family photo. It was from Ethan's first birthday party. Samantha was holding Ethan. Nicholas stood beside her with a hand on her shoulder, and Weston was off to the side, grinning like a fool. He stared at the photo, his vision blurring. "All of you," he muttered. "Every single one of you." Weston crumpled the photo in his hand and hurled it onto the passenger seat. He couldn't let this consume him. He needed to think. He needed a plan. At home, Weston sat at the dining table, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. He spread out old photos, receipts, and anything that might offer him a clue. He went through them, methodically, his anger simmering beneath the surface. A photo of Nicholas holding Lily as a baby caught his eye. The resemblance was uncanny. The same dark eyes, the same sharp nose. Weston clenched his jaw. How the hell did I not see this? He flipped through more pictures. There were countless photos of Nicholas with the kids, smiling, playing, holding them. Too many. It was as if Nicholas had been more involved with his children than he had been. Then there was Samantha. Weston replayed every suspicious moment he could remember. The time she had worked late, the weekend she had gone on girls' trips without him, the way she would sometimes pull away from his touch, only to light up when Nicholas entered the room. 15 years, he said bitterly, his voice echoing in the empty room. 15 goddamn years. He stood abruptly, sending the chair screeching across the floor. He couldn't sit there anymore. He needed to move, to do something. Weston went to the bedroom and pulled out a small safe from under the bed. Inside were the documents that outlined his life, his savings, the house deed, the will he had written years ago naming Samantha and the kids as his beneficiaries. He stared at the papers, his mind racing. "They think I'm trapped," he said aloud, his voice growing stronger. "They think I have nowhere to go." Weston grabbed the documents and threw them onto the bed. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for options. Divorce lawyers, real estate agents, bank account management. He wasn't just going to leave. He was going to dismantle the life they had built on his back. The next morning, Weston called in sick to work. He wasn't sick, but his world was unraveling, and he needed the day to prepare. He started with the bank. Sitting across from the bank manager, he smiled politely, though the fury in his chest burned brightly. "I'd like to close my joint accounts with my wife," Weston said. The manager raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that? It's a big step." Weston nodded. Completely sure. By the time he left the bank, the joint account was empty. The funds transferred to a private account under his name. Next, he contacted a real estate agent. "I want to sell my house," he told her over the phone. "When are you looking to move?" she asked. Immediately. By the afternoon, Weston was back home, a sense of control starting to return. He sat down and wrote a letter, pouring out his anger and disgust and cold, sharp words. "You built your lives on lies," he wrote. "You mock my trust, my love, and my loyalty. I hope it was worth it because everything you've built is about to collapse." He folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. It was addressed to Samantha. That evening, Weston stood in the bedroom he had shared with Samantha for over a decade. He looked around, taking in the photos on the walls, the bed where they had once shared their lives. It no longer felt like home. He grabbed his suitcase and began packing. Clothes, toiletries, his laptop, everything he needed to disappear. As he zipped up the suitcase, he paused, glancing at the framed wedding photo on the nightstand. He picked it up, stared at it for a moment, then dropped it into the trash can without a second thought. Standing at the front door, suitcase in hand, Weston took one last look at the house. It wasn't just a house. It was the place where he had built a life, raised children, and trusted the people he loved most. But now it was just a shell of broken memories. He stepped outside, locking the door behind him. As he walked toward his car, he muttered under his breath, "They think they've won. They think I'm weak." Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the engine and drove off. They have no idea what's coming. Weston stood at the edge of the driveway watching as the for sale sign was hammered into the front lawn. The real estate agent glanced at him, trying to gauge his mood. "You sure you want to move this fast?" she asked, holding a clipboard. "We can take a little more time to set things up." "No," Weston said, his voice firm. "List it as soon as possible. I want it gone." The agent nodded. "All right, I'll call you with offers once they come in." Weston gave a curt nod and turned back toward the house. As he walked through the front door, the familiar smell of home hit him, a mix of freshly brewed coffee and Samantha's lavender-scented candles. For a brief moment, he hesitated. This was his home, his sanctuary for 15 years. But then, the memory of Samantha and Nicholas' laughter on the patio pierced through the haze. His jaw tightened, and he stepped inside. The dining table was cluttered with stacks of papers. Bank statements, property deeds, and financial records were spread out in neat rows. Weston sat down, his laptop open in front of him, the cold glow of the screen illuminating his face. He logged into their joint bank account. The balance stared back at him. $45,326. He thought of all the sacrifices he had made over the years, working long hours, skipping vacations, saving for the future. All of it had been for Samantha, the kids, and the life they had built together. "Not anymore," he muttered to himself. With a few clicks, he transferred every last cent into his private account. The bank sent an email confirmation. Almost instantly, Weston leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. "Step 1, he said quietly. The next morning, Weston was at the courthouse. The clerk behind the counter gave him a polite smile. "How can I help you today?" she asked. "I need to file for divorce," Weston said, sliding the paperwork across the counter. The clerk glanced at the forms, flipping through them. "You've got everything here? Grounds, property, division, custody." She looked up at him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Weston's face didn't flinch. "Absolutely. All right," she said, stamping the papers. "We'll serve her within a few days." Weston nodded. But before leaving, he added, "Make sure she gets them while she's at home. I want there to be no mistake." Back at the house, Weston moved like a ghost, gathering his belongings. A suitcase sat open, on the bed half filled with clothes. He packed quickly but methodically, ensuring he left nothing important behind. As he zipped up the suitcase, he paused, looking around the bedroom. The wedding photo on the dresser caught his eye. Samantha was smiling, her arms wrapped around him. For a moment, he almost felt something, sadness maybe, regret, But then he remembered the sneering tone of her voice as she talked to Nicholas. Loser, she had called him. He picked up the photo, looked at it one last time and snapped it in half before tossing it in the trash. By afternoon, Weston was sitting at the kitchen table, pen in hand. He stared at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. What do you even say to someone who's destroyed everything you believed in? After a moment, he began to write. His handwriting was steady, every word deliberate. You built your lives on lies. Now watch them collapse. He folded the note neatly and placed it in an envelope. On the front, he wrote Samantha's name in bold, sharp letters. 2 days later, Samantha was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. She was pouring herself a cup of coffee when she heard it. Can you get that? She called out to Nicholas, who was lounging in the living room. Sure, he replied, setting down his drink. A moment later, Nicholas walked back in with a confused look on his face. What is it? Samantha asked. Someone just served you, Nicholas said, handing her a stack of papers. Samantha frowned, setting her coffee down as she flipped through the pages. Her face paled as she read. Divorce papers? What? Nicholas said, sitting up straight. Samantha dropped the papers onto the counter and grabbed her phone, dialing Weston's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. The same result. What the hell is this? She said, pacing the kitchen. You didn't even say anything. He just filed. Nicholas picked up the papers and read them over. Looks like he's selling the house too. Samantha froze. What? Nicholas pointed to a section of the documents. Right here. He's liquidating everything. Samantha ran her hands through her hair, panic creeping into her voice. He can't do that. Can he do that? Nicholas shrugged, but before he could answer, Samantha's eyes landed on the envelope sitting on the counter. What's that? Nicholas asked. Samantha tore it open, unfolding the note inside. As her eyes scanned the words, her hands began to tremble. You built your lives on lies. Now watch them collapse. She stared at the note, her breath catching in her throat. Samantha, Nicholas said, standing behind her. What does it say? She handed it to him without a word. Nicholas read it, his jaw tightening. He knows. Samantha slumped into a chair, her head in her hands. This can't be happening. He can't. Just leave. Nicholas leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. Looks like he just did. Weston sat in a motel room miles away, his phone buzzing silently on the table. He glanced at the screen. Samantha's name flashed over and over. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the phone and turned it off, setting it aside. As he stared out the window, the weight on his chest began to lift. For the first time in years, he felt something that had eluded him for far too long. Freedom. Weston adjusted his tie in the mirror of his office, the sunlight pouring through the large windows behind him. The city skyline stretched out beyond the glass, a far cry from the small town life he had left behind. 5 years had passed since he had walked out of his old life. He glanced at the nameplate on his desk. Weston Grayson, founder and CEO. He smirked. Not bad. For a loser, he muttered. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. In the months after disappearing, Weston had struggled to find his footing. Therapy sessions had been grueling at first, forcing him to confront the pain and betrayal that had once consumed him. You keep talking about what you lost, his therapist, Dr. Lang, had said during one early session. But what about what you've gained? Weston scoffed, leaning back on the couch. What have I gained? I lost my wife, my best friend, my kids, my family. Everything I thought was real was a lie. Dr. Lang didn't flinch. You've gained freedom, Weston. You're no longer trapped in their web of lies. You have a chance to build a life that's truly yours. The words had stuck with him, and over time they became his mantra. He poured himself into building that new life. Weston had moved to a bustling city far from his old town. He started small, using the money he had taken from the joint accounts to fund his first venture, a marketing firm. The business took off quickly, and soon he was hiring a team, signing clients, and making a name for himself. But it wasn't just work that helped him heal. Have you considered dating again? Dr. Lang had asked him a couple of years into their sessions. Weston shook his head. I don't think I'm ready for that. You might surprise yourself, Lang replied. Took time, but eventually Weston allowed himself to open up to new relationships. Though he hadn't found love yet, he found companionship. Meeting people who respected him for who he was. While Weston's life flourished, Samantha and Nicholas's lives unraveled. One afternoon, Weston received an email from an old acquaintance, someone who still lived in the town he had left behind. The subject line read, "You won't believe this." Curiosity got the better of him and he opened it. Inside was a link to a local news article. Nicholas's business had gone under, buried under allegations of fraud and unpaid debts. Weston leaned back in his chair, reading the article with a grim satisfaction. "Couldn't happen to a nicer guy," he murmured. The same acquaintance later mentioned how Samantha was barely scraping by, working a dead-end job and struggling to make ends meet. The community had turned on her after Weston's dramatic exit. She deserves every bit of it, Weston thought, though he couldn't deny the small pang of pity he felt. As Weston closed his laptop that evening, he reflected on how far he had come. His old life felt like a distant memory now. The bitterness had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. Standing by the window of his high-rise apartment, Weston sipped a glass of wine, the city lights twinkling below. "You rebuilt your life," he told himself, "and this time it's yours." Weston stepped out of his sleek black car, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The small town looked exactly the same, but he didn't. Dressed in a tailored suit, a gold watch gleaming on his wrist, and an air of quiet authority, he knew he was a stark contrast to the man who had left 5 years ago. The first stop was the diner on Main Street, a place where the locals gathered, and gossip spread like wildfire. As Weston walked in, heads turned. A few people recognized him, whispering his name. "Is that Weston Grayson? Didn't he just vanish one day?" Weston ignored the murmurs and strode to the counter. The waitress, Sandy, did a double take when she saw him. "Weston?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Good to see you, Sandy," he said, flashing a polite smile. "Coffee? Black?" She poured the coffee with shaky hands. "Didn't think we'd ever see you again. You look different." Weston chuckled softly. 5 years can do that. He took his coffee and sat at a table by the window, pulling out his phone. He didn't have to wait long for his appearance to make waves. Within minutes, his old neighbors were texting each other, and word reached Samantha and Nicholas. Samantha was in her tiny apartment when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend. "Weston's back. Saw him at the diner. He looks different. You should see this." Her heart sank. She read the message again, hoping she'd misunderstood. "Weston," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. "Who's that?" Nicholas called from the other room. Samantha didn't answer. She grabbed her purse and left, ignoring Nicholas' questions as she slammed the door. Nicholas heard the buzz of his own phone minutes later. Curious, he checked his messages. One from a former coworker caught his eye. "Weston Grayson? Back in town? Didn't you think he'd never show his face again?" Nicholas frowned, a pit forming in his stomach. He remembered the letter Weston had left behind. Now watch them collapse. This can't be good. Nicholas muttered to himself, grabbing his keys. Weston wasn't at the diner when Samantha arrived, but she could still feel his presence lingering in the whispers of the people around her. She caught snippets of conversations. "Did you see the car he's driving? He looks like a millionaire. Wonder why he's back." Samantha left, her hands trembling. She returned home to find Nicholas pacing. "He's back," she said barely, above a whisper. "I know," Nicholas replied, his voice tense. "The question is why?" Weston was already working on the why. He had spent the last few days gathering information. Through private investigators and old contacts, he learned everything about Samantha and Nicholas' downfall. Nicholas' failed business, Samantha's dead-end job, their crumbling reputations. From his hotel room, he drafted an anonymous letter to the local newspaper. It included just enough detail to hint at their long affair, Nicholas' financial misdeeds, and the paternity of the children. He attached photos and documents, ensuring everything looked authentic. The letter ended with a simple statement: "The truth always comes to light." Satisfied, Weston sealed the envelope and smiled. Let the chaos begin. The atmosphere at the family gathering was awkward, as it always was. Weston had requested the reunion himself, his tone polite yet firm when he called his parents. "It's been 5 years," he had said. "I think it's time we all talked." They hadn't expected him to return, much less extend an olive branch. His mother eagerly agreed, sensing an opportunity to mend what had been broken. Nicholas and Samantha, however, were uneasy, especially after hearing rumors of Weston's dramatic return to town. The reunion was set at his parents' home, where the dining room table was piled with food. Conversations were polite, strained. Weston sat at the head of the table, calmly sipping his drink as he observed the people who had betrayed him. Samantha was seated a few chairs away, avoiding eye contact, while Nicholas fidgeted with his silverware. Weston's father tried to lighten the mood. "It's good to see you again, son. You've done well for yourself. That business of yours, impressive." Weston smiled faintly. "Yes, I've been busy. Rebuilding. Starting fresh is liberating." Samantha shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly. In her lap, Nicholas cleared his throat. "So, what brought you back?" Weston set his glass down, the soft clink silencing the table. He leaned forward, his eyes sweeping across the room. "I came back for closure." The tension thickened. His mother forced a nervous laugh. "Closure? That sounds so serious." "It is." Weston's voice was sharp. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder, dropping it onto the table with a thud. Everyone stared at it. "What's that?" Nicholas asked, his voice low. "Proof," Weston said, his tone cold. "Proof of what you all did to me." His mother's face went pale. "Weston, what are you talking about?" Weston opened the folder and began pulling out documents and photos, sliding them across the table. A DNA test, bank records, screenshots of texts between Samantha and Nicholas. "Let's start with this," Weston said, holding up the DNA test. "This proves that neither of the kids I raised are mine. They're yours, Nicholas." Samantha gasped, her face crumbling. "Weston, please don't interrupt me," he snapped, his voice cutting through the air. He turned to Nicholas. "You were my best friend. You slept with my wife for 15 years. And you he shifted his glare to his parents. Knew the entire time. You knew those kids weren't mine, and you said nothing." His father looked down at his plate, ashamed. His mother's voice trembled. "We didn't want to hurt you, Weston. We thought it was for the best." Weston cut her off. "The best for who? You? Samantha? Nicholas? Certainly not me." The teenagers, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. "What does he mean?" The older one asked, looking at Samantha. Samantha's eyes filled with tears. "It's complicated." "No, it's simple," Weston said, his tone cold. "Nicholas is your biological father. Not me. I was just the idiot who raised you." The room erupted. The teenagers shouted questions at Samantha and Nicholas. Weston's parents tried to calm everyone down, but Weston raised his voice. "Enough." The room fell silent. "You all lied to me for years," Weston said, standing up. "But you can't lie anymore. Everyone in this town will know the truth." Samantha dropped to her knees, sobbing. "Weston, I'm begging you, don't do this. I made mistakes, but I loved you." "Loved me?" Weston scoffed. "You loved the security I gave you, not me." Nicholas tried to interject. "All right, Weston, that's enough." Weston cut him off. "You don't get to tell me what's enough. You destroyed my life. Now it's your turn." He turned to his parents one last time. "You chose loyalty to lies over loyalty to your own son. Don't expect forgiveness from me." Without another word, Weston walked out of the house, leaving behind a shattered family and a room full of chaos. The knock on Weston's office door was hesitant, almost desperate. He looked up for his laptop, already knowing who it was. The receptionist had warned him earlier. "They're here again," she'd whispered. "Let them wait," Weston had replied. Now, after nearly an hour of making them stew in the lobby, he gestured for his assistant to open the door. Samantha walked in. First, her once pristine appearance now disheveled. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame. Behind her, Nicholas followed, his usual swagger replaced by a defeated slouch. Weston didn't stand. He leaned back in his chair, studying them with cold detachment. "Weston," Samantha began, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." "Talk." Weston's voice was calm, almost amused. What could you possibly have left to say? Nicholas stepped forward, his hands outstretched. Look, man, we messed up. We know that. But this has gone too far. You've ruined everything. Weston raised an eyebrow. Ruined everything? Funny. That's exactly what I thought 5 years ago, when I found out you two had been ruining my life for 15 years. Samantha broke into tears. Weston, please. I'm begging you. I know. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but the kids, they're suffering. They don't understand why this is happening. Weston's jaw tightened. Don't you dare bring the kids into this. You lied to me about them for their entire lives. You and Nicholas used me as your safety net while you played house behind my back. Now, you want to talk about suffering? Nicholas tried again, his voice desperate. Weston, we're bankrupt. I've lost everything, my business, my reputation. People won't even look me in the eye anymore. You've made your point. Can't we just move on? Weston stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked around the desk, closing the space between them. Move on, he repeated, his voice sharp. For 15 years, you two mocked me. Call me oblivious, a loser. You built your lives on my trust, my money, my kindness. And now that the tables have turned, you want mercy? Samantha fell to her knees, clutching at his hand. I was wrong, Weston. I was selfish and stupid, and I've lost everything. Please just stop. We can't take this anymore. He pulled his hand away, his expression unmoved. You didn't think about what I could take when you were sneaking around with him. You didn't think about what I was losing when you laughed behind my back. So no, Samantha, I won't stop. Nicholas' anger flared. This is vindictive. You're punishing us for a mistake. Weston turned on him, his eyes cold. A mistake? 15 years. Isn't a mistake. It's a choice. A choice you made every single day while I trusted you. Don't talk to me about punishment, Nicholas. You haven't even begun to pay for what you did. Silence filled the room as Weston stepped back, his tone softening but losing none of its edge. You want my forgiveness? He asked, looking at them both. Earn it, but don't expect it. Not now, and maybe not ever. Without another word, Weston walked out, leaving Samantha sobbing on the floor, and Nicholas staring blankly at the wall. Weston sat at a quiet cafe in the city, a cup of coffee, warming his hands. It was his routine spot, a place where he could unwind without being recognized. He had no intention of meeting anyone that day, let alone Melody. She walked in, juggling a stack of books and a coffee order slip. The books slipped from her grip as she reached the counter. Without thinking, Weston got up to help her. Thanks, she said, brushing her hair out of her face. I really need to stop carrying half the library with me. Weston handed her the last book and smiled. Sometimes the extra weight is worth it. She chuckled. True, but my arms would disagree. Could have ended there, just a polite exchange between strangers, but something about Melody intrigued Weston. She wasn't overly polished or trying to impress anyone. She seemed genuine, something he hadn't encountered in years. When Melody's order was called, she hesitated before walking away. If you're not in a rush, would you like to join me? I could use a distraction from all this reading. Weston raised an eyebrow. You're asking a stranger to help you avoid studying? Exactly, she said with a grin. Weston laughed. All right, why not? Over the next hour, they talked about everything and nothing. Melody was a freelance editor, passionate about books and storytelling. She had a calm demeanor, but her enthusiasm for certain topics brought a spark to her eyes that Weston couldn't ignore. What about you? She asked, tilting her head. You seem grounded, but there's this weight you carry, like you've been through a lot. Weston paused, surprised by her observation. That obvious, huh? Not really, but I'm good at reading people, Melody said, sipping her coffee. You don't have to share if you're not comfortable. For the first time in years, Weston felt safe opening up. He didn't tell her everything, just bits and pieces about betrayal, starting over and rebuilding his life. Melody listened intently, never interrupting or prying. You've been through a storm, she said softly, but you're still here. That's something to be proud of. Weston felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't pity or judgment, just understanding. Over the weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Coffee turned into dinners, and dinners turned into long walks. Melody never pushed him, and Weston found himself wanting to share more of his life with her. One evening, during a walk by the river, Weston stopped and turned to her. "You know, I never thought I'd trust anyone again. But you've shown me that not everyone is out to hurt me." Melody smiled, her eyes meeting his. "And you've shown me that even after the hardest battles, people can still rebuild. It's not about the past, Weston. It's about what you do with the future." In that moment, Weston realized he wasn't just moving forward. He was truly letting go. For the first time in years, he felt free. 5 years had passed since Weston had exposed the lies, and time had not been kind to Samantha and Nicholas. Their once privileged lives had spiraled downward. Samantha, unable to find steady work after the scandal, was constantly scrambling to make ends meet. The weight of her past mistakes haunted her. Every day, she would pass by stores and people would whisper. The town she once called home now regarded her as nothing more than the woman who destroyed her family. Nicholas, once a rising star in the business world, had become a cautionary tale. His company had gone bankrupt, his associates had distanced themselves, and his reputation had been tarnished beyond repair. Every business venture he tried to pursue ended in failure. He would drink to drown out the shame, but it only made things worse. Their children, now teenagers, struggled to understand the shattered world they'd been left with. Their lives, too, had been upended. They lived in a broken home, knowing that the family they'd once believed in was nothing more than a series of lies. Weston, on the other hand, had moved on. He'd build a life for himself, one that was grounded in truth, respect, and genuine connections. Melody had become his anchor. Together, they traveled, explored new hobbies, and created a life free from the shackles of his past. One Sunday afternoon, as he and Melody sat on their balcony, Weston spoke quietly, his gaze distant. "Do you ever think about what happened?" Melody asked, sensing his shift in mood. Weston sighed. "Sometimes. It's hard not to, but I've learned a lot from it. About trust. About myself." Melody reached for his hand. "You've grown stronger because of it, Weston, and that's what matters." He nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. "I used to think I'd never be able to move past it, but now I see it as a lesson." On the anniversary of his parents' death, Weston decided to visit their graves. He hadn't been back since their funeral. As he stood in front of their tombstones, memories flooded his mind. The love they had shown him, the sacrifices they had made, it all seemed distant now, but it had shaped him into who he was. Weston stood quietly for a moment, then dropped to his knees, placing a single white flower on the grave. "I don't know if you ever really understood me, but I've learned to understand myself. I've learned what it means to trust and what it means to trust myself." He paused, reflecting on the years of pain, betrayal, and growth. "I'm free now. I'll let it all go, and I've built something new, something that's mine." As he stood up, Melody joined him, her hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. Weston smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He knew that the past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. With one last look at his parents' graves, Weston turned to Melody. "Let's go home." And as they walked away, the weight of his past finally lifted. He had won not just the battle with Samantha and Nicholas, but the war for his own peace and happiness.